You're watching VinylicPumaGaming. So Borderlands 2 features a very diverse cast of enemies. You have everything from skags, to spider ants, to threshers, to crystalisks, and much more. Borderlands 2's DLC also features orcs, skeletons, drifters, boroks, and sandworms. Of course, you have the other enemies that the franchise is known for, like psychos, marauders, and bruisers. But today, I want to talk about various enemies in Borderlands 2 that can be fairly difficult to deal with, especially when you're playing by yourself. Now, before we get into this video, I will be only including mob-type enemies in this video. Unique enemies like Scorch and Knuckle Dragger are mini-boss enemies, and other enemies like Terramorphous and Veracitus are raid bosses, and I've already made a video on the worst bosses in Borderlands 2. This video will mostly include generic enemies that you can encounter throughout the game, and believe it or not, there are quite a few that can prove to be fairly formidable. But without further ado, these will be the top 10 most annoying, hardest, and worst mob enemies in Borderlands 2, starting with number 10, and that's going to be Buzzards. While Buzzards aren't necessarily too bad to deal with one-on-one, Buzzards typically appear in groups of 2 or 3, and in large open areas where you have very little cover. While they certainly aren't the strongest enemies in the game, Buzzards can actually be fairly difficult to hit, especially when the player aims down sights. Buzzards occur frequently throughout the game, and one of the earliest areas you can start to encounter Buzzards is at Tundra Express, just before you have to fight Wilhelm. And of course, you will also encounter Buzzards in places like Thousand Cuts, Sawtooth Cauldron, The Dust, and even some of Torg's Campaign of Carnage DLC. You may also find that Buzzards are difficult to deal with because they frequently spawn near and around other bandit-type enemies, and unless you're properly equipped with the right weapons that fire a lot of projectiles, you may find that these things can be fairly difficult to take down. There are a couple upsides to Buzzards though. Buzzards never spawn in-game with shields, making them much easier to deal with than most regular mob enemies, assuming you can hit them. And compared to other vehicles that you may encounter, like bandit technicals, Buzzards go down relatively easy, and you don't have to worry about them running you over, which will instantly put you in fight for your life or kill you outright. As far as characters are concerned, Maya's phase lock works fairly well against Buzzards. While she can't lock a Buzzard in place, phase lock will deal a substantial amount of damage to Buzzards, making them a little easier to take out. Like I said, you usually encounter these in places like Tundra Express, Sawtooth Cauldron, and Thousand Cuts. You can also encounter Buzzards in the Forge from Torg's Campaign of Carnage DLC as well. Focus on the other enemies around you first before you take these things out. Number 9. Armored Psychos. You'd think that after all this time that I would be used to seeing and not panicking whenever I encountered an armored psycho. After all this time, I still get a slight adrenaline rush whenever I see these enemies, especially when I have mostly fire weapons equipped. Now, the Armored Psycho is mostly vulnerable to corrosive damage. However, when you first encounter them in true Vault Hunter mode, you'll find that you may not have any corrosive weapons on hand that are good enough to take them out, and this can prove to be a problem. However, the nice thing is that if you're skilled, the Armored Psycho is still vulnerable to fire damage, provided that they are shot in the head. In fact, the best way to deal damage to Armored Psychos is to fire directly at their crit spots both with or without slag. In fact, Maya can usually take these guys down pretty easily with phase lock. Phase lock will suspend them midair, making it much easier to properly aim and shoot their faces. And depending on your weapons, Armored Psychos will go down pretty easily. Otherwise, you're just going to have to be fast and quickly aim and shoot their crit spots while they're charging you. This is a little harder, but it's the best way to take them out. As I alluded to earlier, you're not going to see Armored Psychos in normal mode. However, you will begin to encounter them in both True and Ultimate Vault Hunter modes. Keep in mind that the Ultimate Vault Hunter mode versions also regenerate health, so it behooves you to focus on them and take them out first before dealing with the other various bandits. For one-on-one scenarios, Armored Psychos aren't too bad. However, in groups with other psychos, they can be pretty deadly. Number 8. Nomads with shields. Early on in the game, nomads can prove to be fairly formidable. That said, the basic nomad you encounter is relatively easy to beat. However, the nomad pyros that first appear in Frostburn Canyon can prove to be tricky, especially if you rely primarily on dealing fire damage to your enemies, as nomad pyros are extremely resistant to fire damage. Later on, once you enter Bloodshot Stronghold, you'll start to encounter nomads with physical shields. Depending on your weapons, you may find that you can't even damage these enemies by shooting at them directly, and you'll need to either distract them with Axton's turret, sneak around them with Zero's Deception, or phase lock them with Maya. That way you can get a better angle of attack. Otherwise, you're going to have to rely on Torg or other weapons with some kind of splash damage in order to take them out. Even then, in the case of badass nomads, you'll find that they can prove to be difficult to take down thanks to their very high health. Like I said, the best way to take these guys down, regardless of level, is to use weapons with splash damage, or you can use rocket launchers and grenades, as they work pretty well as well. Sadly, shielded nomads are fairly common throughout the game and usually tend to occur in areas after Bloodshot Stronghold where you can find a significant number of bandits. Before then, you'll usually just encounter regular nomad type enemies along with the nomad pyros you can fight in Frostburn Canyon. Really, as long as you bring the proper equipment, these guys shouldn't be too bad. Number 7. Wormhole Threshers. While you can take these enemies out fairly easy if you get the drop on them, Wormhole Threshers can actually prove to be fairly challenging provided that they catch you off guard, especially in later difficulties. While Wormhole Threshers aren't quite as powerful as badass Pyro Threshers, they're still difficult to deal with thanks in large part to their singularity attack. As the name implies, Wormhole Threshers generate a singularity that sucks the player in, and if the player gets too close to the Thresher, they will suddenly start taking on a bunch of damage, and they risk the possibility of dying. To make matters worse, because Threshers can burrow underground in between attacks, they can use that time to heal and recover from various status effects while being burrowed. As you can imagine, this makes the Black Hole and Rift Threshers very dangerous in True and Ultimate Vault Hunter mode respectively. Your best bet is to try to get the drop on them and quickly take them out before they burrow, because if they do, there's a good chance that these Threshers will heal a significant portion of their health. It's also worth mentioning that Terramorphous has an attack that's similar to the Wormhole Thresher's Vortex ability. Axton can actually negate the Vortex's pull by entering the force field provided by the Phalanx Shield skill. Of course, you're going to have your turrets out, and you're going to have to throw them out quickly as to not get caught in the Vortex. Keep in mind too that Threshers as enemies are relatively uncommon, so you shouldn't have to run into too many of these. That said, you will encounter at least a couple as you play through Borderlands 2. Number 6. Loader Variants. Now, your typical loaders that you're going to find, which are also known as gun loaders, aren't really too bad to deal with. You can usually just shoot their joints and they're pretty much dead. Plus, they're slow moving and they're relatively easy for the player to hit. However, there are other loader types that are actually pretty difficult. The first type that you'll encounter are EXP or explosive loaders, which run towards you and detonate if you let them get too close. And unlike regular bandit suiciders, loaders have a little more health and are a little bit harder to take down. There are also ion loaders, which are very resistant to all shock damage, and they also have the ability to deploy shields that essentially make them and the other enemies inside them invulnerable to all attack. The worst part about ion loaders, though, is that if you enter that invulnerable shield yourself, you'll get shocked by it. And there are also power loaders, which have these spinning blades on their arms that reflect most bullets back at the player. Power loaders need to be distracted to be taken out, or you need weapons with splash damage to bypass this reflectability. There are also RPG loaders, which are equipped with various rocket launchers that exist throughout the game. If one of these rockets hits you, it can put you in fight for your life almost instantly. And of course, there are also Sergeant loaders, as well as the Angelic Guard, which have reinforced joints, which makes performing critical hits on them very difficult. As I mentioned previously, most loaders, like gun loaders, are usually not that much of a problem. The loaders you should really worry about are the loader variants that can spawn with other loaders, especially if you have to deal with Ion, Power, RPG, and even Sergeant or Angelic Guard type loaders. Loaders are very common throughout the game, and some variants of loaders occur throughout most of the DLCs. As all these enemies are vulnerable to corrosive damage, that's usually your best way to take them out. Number 5. Savages and Witch Doctors. So both Savages and Witch Doctors were added with the Hammerlock's Big Game Hunt DLC, and you shouldn't really encounter them outside of that DLC. Though you do have a chance of encountering these enemies in the Son of Cromarax DLC, which isn't too surprising since it is Hammerlock themed. Really, the Savage Triggermen aren't really so bad. They're basically like bandits, and they're relatively easy to crit. Savage Warriors and Witch Doctors, on the other hand, can prove to be fairly difficult to deal critical hits to, since their face masks block the major crit spots. Warriors in particular also carry shields, which will block a significant amount of damage from most weapons, and Witch Doctors are fairly resistant to Maya's face lock, and some can heal themselves and transform into tornadoes, making them difficult to deal damage to, and thus making them very dangerous. The biggest thing, though, about Witch Doctors is that they can level up their fellow Savages, making them stronger in the process. And if the Savages are leveled up and they've received some damage, all of their health is fully restored too. If you encounter groups of Savages accompanied by a Witch Doctor, your best course of action is to take out the Witch Doctor first, and once he's down, the other Savages can't be leveled up, healed, or buffed in any other way, and become a little bit more manageable. While you'll still have some issues with the Savage Warriors, typically the Savage Hunters that throw spears and the Triggermen that fire guns are a lot easier to take down. Generally, you're going to want to bring hard-hitting weapons to take these guys down. The Savage Warriors that charge you with the shields are vulnerable to weapons with splash damage. As mentioned earlier, Savages and Witch Doctors appear in the Hammerlock Big Game Hunt DLC, as well as the Son of Cromarax DLC for Borderlands 2, and they shouldn't appear anywhere else. Number 4. Skeletons in general. Now, I know this is pretty vague, but I'm of the opinion that skeletons suck and are hard to deal with, especially in groups, and you may find that these types of enemies can be difficult to hit, as they are generally thinner than most of the other enemies in the game. And I've usually found that while melee-based skeletons can be difficult, the skeletons that are usually the most difficult to deal with make use of ranged attacks. Skeleton archers in particular tend to spawn in groups, and their arrows will immediately slow the player down if they manage to hit, and this can make running away and dodging very difficult. There are also brittle skeletons, which are usually blue and are not just more durable than your standard skeletons, but they also have the potential to reflect projectiles back at the player, making them almost impossible to take out unless you're using rockets, Torg weapons, or TDR reloads to take them out. You also have skeleton mages, which constantly teleport around the area and are difficult to damage because as soon as you start attacking, they can quickly warp out, heal a little bit, and then warp back in. And if you slag a skeleton mage and it warps out, it will have the slag effect removed when it finally reappears. While I feel like a broken record, weapons that deal splash damage have a tendency to do really well up against skeletons. The good thing is that they only appear in the Dragon Keep DLC. However, the bad thing is that skeletons are pretty common throughout the Dragon Keep DLC and can be difficult to fight in some scenarios. Number 3. Badass Surveyors. Typically, most surveyors in Borderlands 2 are only a minor annoyance and are usually accompanied by loaders and other Hyperion units. Usually a couple shots in their direction is enough to wipe them out, and in the worst case scenario, they usually only heal loader type enemies. However, Badass Surveyors are one of the reasons that the Digistruct Peak add-on is so difficult. Instead of just restoring shields, Badass Surveyors from the Digistruct Peak add-on will automatically heal any enemy that you fight with. This includes robot loader type enemies, as well as random enemies like Digistructed Raiders, and various mini-boss enemies like Scorch, Dukino's mom, and even the Assassins. As you can imagine, Surveyors can make your confrontations with all of these enemies much more difficult. Plus, you have to be really careful and make sure you take out the Surveyors before you focus on the other enemies in the arena. In some cases, more surveyors can spawn and heal the tougher enemies anyway, thus dragging out what was already a difficult fight to begin with. As is always the case, always try to take out the surveyors first. Surveyors will always circle around the player and then fly directly towards you and fire their projectiles. In this case, what you should do is make sure you've got them lined up and then fire until they go down. In normal and true Vault Hunter mode, these things should be pretty easy to take out. It's just that you're going to have a lot of problems with the badass versions that appear in Digistruct Peak. As I said, surveyors are usually just a minor annoyance, but on Digistruct Peak, they can prove to be deadly. Number 2. Rabid Skags and Rabid Stalkers. So while these are two totally different enemies, they go together in my mind, and they also appear in the same color. Of the two, the Stalkers are probably more difficult, but Rabid Skags are still pretty formidable and deal an impressive amount of damage. Either way, both enemies move very fast and can be difficult to deal with. Rabid Skags and Stalkers are hyper-aggressive and will attack you or whoever is closest to them relentlessly. And what makes them more difficult to deal with is that they frequently spawn accompanying other various types of their corresponding enemy types, meaning that you won't usually just have to fight one Rabid Skag or Rabid Stalker, but you will actually have to fight several other enemies too. And on rare occasions, you may even find that you have to fight 2 Rabid Skags or 2 Rabid Stalkers, accompanying even more enemies. My best advice for dealing with these enemies is to try to take them out first. You can usually take a couple hits from other Stalkers or Skags that you'll encounter, but these guys can easily bring you down in a couple hits. So therefore, Maya is going to be a good choice against these guys, as Phase Lock works pretty well against the Rabid Skags, but may prove to be a little more difficult up against the Rabid Stalker. For Rabid Stalkers, your best course of action is going to be to try and deplete their shield, and then attack them with weapons that deal a decent amount of damage over a wide area. So think of a weapon like a grenade or a rocket launcher. Both of these enemies can be found on true Vault Hunter mode and up, and appear wherever most Skags and Stalkers spawn. Make sure you have good equipment before you take out either of these enemies, because they are very tough. Number 1. Badass Iron Golems. If you thought that regular golems were difficult, then you probably haven't dealt with iron golems. Out of all of the enemies on this list, iron golems might just be the strongest. Initially, they have a fair amount of health and have a combination of both powerful melee as well as ranged attacks. However, what makes the badass Iron Golem so powerful is that it can level up and get stronger much like a Goliath would. And after several transformation, you can spawn an Iron God, which at OP8 difficulty is a level 92 enemy. And to give you guys some idea, the Iron God not only has a massive amount of health, but it also has a ridiculous amount of damage reduction. And according to the Borderlands wiki, the Iron God has 99.2% damage reduction at level 92. And I would say that in this sense, the Iron God is by far the strongest mob type enemy in Borderlands 2. Otherwise, Iron Golems aren't too difficult. I've found that as long as you slag them and shoot at them repeatedly with some good weapons, they tend to go down pretty easily. As for the Iron God variant, they're just absolutely monstrous and difficult to defeat. If you decide to go after the Iron God, I recommend that you at least bring Salvador, so that way you can both deal a bunch of damage as well as heal off of all of the damage you're dealing with the Grog Nozzle. Now, golems in general were added with the Dragon Keep DLC. You won't encounter any super overpowered god forms of the various golems unless you attack and destroy their furnaces, making them unbound. Even then, you have to wait for them and allow them to kill other enemies in order to get either a rock or iron god. And it's possible to play through all of the Dragon Keep DLC without encountering a single rock or iron god. The Iron Golem can be found on your way through the Mines of Avarice. There's an area where orcs are laying siege to the dwarfs, and you can convince the Iron Golem to come down and attack you if you just start shooting at it. From there, it's just a matter of leveling the thing up and trying to attack and kill an Iron God. Alright guys, that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you like this video, please be sure to leave a like, and as always, take care, and I'll see y'all next time.